Today we will explore the most terrifying punishment system of the Middle Ages. In this video, which I definitely do not recommend for the faint of the heart, we will discuss topics such as the concept of crime in the Middle Ages, methods of punishment, and how the justice system operated. But how did the Middle Ages define crime? What were the methods of punishment, and how did the justice system enforce its laws? So, while you prepare your tea or coffee, I'll begin the explanation. One day you stole something, or said the wrong thing to the wrong person. Do you know what the consequences would be? But what if you committed a crime in the Middle Ages? What would happen to you? To understand this, we first need to look at what crime meant in the Middle Ages. 1. The concept of crime and the justice system. In the Middle Ages, committing a crime was not only a violation of the law, it was also a violation of God. If people were accused of violating God's will, they would be punished not only in this world, but also in the afterlife. The criminal was therefore a target not only of the law, but also of religious rules. Crime was seen as a social and religious problem. Justice was usually administered by the church, feudal lords, or kings. The church had great power as it was seen as God's representative on earth. Feudal lords had absolute authority over the peasants living on their lands. Kings, on the other hand, ruled over a wider area and determined the course of justice through their own governmental decisions. The form of justice depended on the social class of the person. While the nobility often got away with crimes with financial penalties, peasants and lower classes could face harsher punishments, or perhaps even death, for the same crimes. Social class was the main factor determining how harsh or lenient justice would be in the Middle Ages. 2. The most common crimes and their punishments. But what were the most common crimes of the Middle Ages? How widespread were they really? And which crimes were people most guilty of? Let's take a closer look at the most common crimes of the period and the punishments for them. A. Theft. Theft was a very serious crime in the Middle Ages. Thieves were usually punished with flogging, imprisonment, or exile, rarely with amputation. The severity of the punishment depended on the severity of the crime and the decision of the local authority. The severity of the punishment was determined by the value of the stolen property. A small robbery could lead to lighter penalties, while a large and valuable robbery could even result in death. In some cases, thieves were paraded in public. "I am a thief" signs were hung around their necks, and they were allowed to be booed or even stoned by the public. This humiliating event showed people what happens to them when they commit a crime. B. Murder. Murder was one of the most serious crimes in the Middle Ages, and was usually punishable by the death penalty. People who committed murder could be hanged, beheaded, or impaled. The punishment for murder varied according to the social class of the perpetrator. Nobles were sometimes only punished with a fine, while peasants were often subjected to capital punishment such as execution. Wrong decisions by the courts led to some murders going unpunished. The unpunished murders led to a culture of blood feuds. Families or communities would take the murder into their own hands to avenge the murdered person. This sometimes involved the justice of the people, instead of the courts. See witchcraft and wizardry. The punishment for the crime of witchcraft was often quite brutal. Offenders could be burned, drowned, or forced to confess through torture. Those accused of witchcraft were literally hunted down. Yes, you heard right. Witch hunts caused great fear in society during the Middle Ages. Many innocent people were accused of being witches and killed during this period. Interestingly, you could accuse someone of witchcraft and even cause their death just because you didn't like them. Those accused of witchcraft were often thought to be practicing black magic. Some spells were not banned, but black magic and collaboration with the devil were considered serious crimes. Such crimes could result in the death penalty, as in witchcraft. D. Treason and crimes against the king. Treason was one of the most dreaded crimes in the Middle Ages. Criminals guilty of treason could face horrible punishments, such as quartering, the cutting of the body into 4 parts. Sometimes the offender was punished by being skinned alive. Punishments for treason among the nobility were more honorable. Nobles were usually punished by drinking poison or a beheading, while commoners were not subjected to such punishments. Another interesting fact is that insulting the king was considered treason. Even the smallest insult against the king could result in death. Anyone who insulted the king or tried to defy him would be cruelly punished. Loyalty to the king made the difference between life and death. E. Religious crimes. Acting against the Christian faith was another major offense in the Middle Ages. The church was held responsible for all kinds of religious crimes and prosecuted all offenses against religion through the Inquisition courts. Inquisition courts would arrest anti-religious criminals and force them to confess under torture. These tribunals were especially known for their horrific treatment of those who deviated from religion. Non-belief was considered one of the worst crimes in the Middle Ages. Atheism was an idea that was absolutely unacceptable to society, and those who held such views could be punished with the harshest methods. 3. The dark side of justice: torture. In the Middle Ages, criminals were subjected to terrible tortures to extract confessions. These tortures revealed the dark side of justice. Torture methods aimed to completely breaking people down physically and psychologically in order to make them admit guilt. Some of the most brutal methods are as follows. A. Stretching bench. In this torture, the offender's arms and legs were pulled and stretched. The criminals whose limbs were severed would die in agony. B. The Iron Virgin. The criminal was tortured in a coffin with spikes. This method severely injured the criminal's body and was very painful. C. The torture chair. This chair had a barbed seat. The criminal was made to sit in this chair and suffer for hours. D. Water test. In the Middle Ages, the water test was used on people accused of witchcraft to determine whether they were guilty or not. In the immersion test, if the person rose to the surface of the water, they were judged to be a witch. If a person sank into the water, he was considered innocent and was rescued by throwing a rope into the water, but this test usually resulted in death. 4. Courts and the administration of justice in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, courts were often run by nobles, priests, or feudal lords. They could make biased decisions to protect their own interests and social status. Therefore, courts were often not fair and impartial. While nobles often favored judges who were close to them, justice for the lower classes, especially peasants, could be harsher and more brutal. Decisions on the guilt or innocence of the accused were often based on testimonies and rumors rather than concrete evidence. The testimony of witnesses was considered the strongest evidence in court. This sometimes led to even innocent people being declared guilty. Also in the Middle Ages, written documents and physical evidence were often not considered reliable enough, so there was a lot of uncertainty in determining guilt. In some cases, criminals were lynched by the public before being tried in court, particularly in towns or villages. People would directly punish the guilty in the name of their own justice. Such public lynchings meant that the offender was killed or seriously harmed before going to court. Often, although the lynched individuals were later recognized as guilty, these actions were usually not sanctioned by any official judicial body. Alternative punishments and methods of justification. In the Middle Ages, criminals were subjected to painful and interesting tests to prove their innocence. These tests were often seen by the public as an opportunity for the guilty to prove their innocence. For example, the guilty person would be given a red-hot iron and would hold their hands and wait to see if they burned. If the person could withstand the pain, they were presumed innocent, but often the test resulted in fatal or serious injuries. For serious crimes, such as murder, the guilty person could avoid punishment by paying a so-called blood money to the victim's family. This practice was particularly common among the nobility, who could sometimes be redeemed with money alone. Virgil would have freed the offender from punishment and provided financial compensation to the victim's family. However, this practice did not apply to the lower classes, and for peasants, there was no question of paying money in lieu of the murdered person. Some criminals could be exiled outside the city even without a court order. Such punishments led to the criminal being ostracized from the community and declared as an outlaw. The exiled person would be completely cut off from social life and would never have the chance to return. Although exile was sometimes seen as a lighter option compared to the death penalty, it could be extremely difficult for a person to survive. 6. Comparison of medieval justice with the modern world. As we mentioned at the beginning of the video, crime in the Middle Ages was seen as a violation of both law and God. In this period, the social status or beliefs of criminals greatly influenced their punishment. In today's world, however, the concept of crime is more related to the rights of individuals, social order, and violations of the law. Modern law takes into account the degree of guilt and personal responsibility of the guilty person. In addition, many reforms have been made to ensure a more objective administration of justice. The punishments in the Middle Ages seemed quite barbaric compared to today's justice system. Depending on the crimes people committed, torture, the death penalty, and other horrible punishments were applied. For example, criminals were punished by public exposure, killed, or tortured. In the modern world, criminals are often subjected to rehabilitation processes and executions are much more limited. These punishments, now considered human rights violations, are now banned in most countries. In short, some punishments from the Middle Ages are still practiced in various places today. For example, in some countries, executions are still carried out in public, while torture and harsh tests are still part of some local traditions. 7. Closing. In the Middle Ages, the price for committing a crime was often death or eternal torture. We have seen how justice worked in those times and how cruel the punishments were. So if you were a criminal back then, could you have saved yourself from these terrible punishments? If you have watched my video so far, you can support me by subscribing to my channel and turning on the notification bells. See you in my next video. Bye!